Okay, today's daf we're learning is Pesachim daf Lamed Vav. Today's daf is sponsored by Jennifer Neck in honor of her Talmud teacher, Samara Schwartz. Samara started my learning journey by teaching the way of the Talmud, and I am now proud to be part of the Hadran community. Okay, we're going to start with the bottom of Lamed Vav, Lamed Hamud Bet. We saw yesterday's daf, Atanu Rabbanan. The whole daf yesterday was all about what you can use to make matzah with. First we started with which types of grains. We got into the famous kitniot issue. Then we are getting into the types of, there might be some sort of forbidden nature to it or special sanctity to it. So we were talking here about tevel, and they said maybe you could be yotze yedei chovah with tevel shaloni taken, that wasn't fixed. And then they're going to prove that you can't. But first they ask, what do you mean tevel that wasn't fixed? Of course, tevel, any tevel isn't fixed. It means untithed produce. So they say, well, maybe part of the tevel, part of the truma you took, and not all of the things that you're supposed to take. If you remember, there's a whole list of things. In fact, the Koran has a great picture, a graphic of all the different things you're supposed to take. If you have the Koran, it's a nice thing to look at. So there's kind of, it sounds like there's this hierarchy that maybe you would have thought, as long as you took the first thing, but didn't take the second, or the second, not the third not the fourth, etc. In any case, it's forbidden. Why? Because it says, lo tochal alav chametz, and they say, whatever's usher because of chametz, that can be used to make matzah. Again, we have this comparison all the time because the pasuk put together, juxtaposed, don't eat chametz, eat matzah. They say, therefore, only something that potentially could become leavened and would then, right, that's, let's say, to get rid of kitniot, which can't leaven, or otherwise than Yochanan ben Nuri, who thinks yes, or something that wouldn't be forbidden because of chametz. Now, tevel would be forbidden because it's tevel, not because it's chametz. So to which the Gemara asks, right, and here's a great question, in other words, what do you mean? You have tevel, produce, that you didn't take the truma d'masrot from, and then it leavens. What? It's not usher because of chametz? Of course it's usher mishum chametz, just because it's also tevel. So they say, Amar Rav Sheshet. Rav Sheshet's answer was, Hamani Rabbi Shimon. This is Rabbi Shimon's opinion. Da'amar ein isur halal isur. It's a very famous machloket. We're going to understand this much better when we see a much more in-depth sugya about it, which is something that's forbidden, and then it becomes forbidden for another reason. We don't add another isur to it. So this was tevel to begin with, when you cut it, and then you put it in the pile, and you do the flattening of the pile, it became chayav, right? It became tevel, forbidden until you take the truma d'masrot. Then it leavened. First it had that, and when he says ein isur halal isur, it's when they don't happen at the same time. So if one happened first, this was tevel first, therefore it's not going to be forbidden because of chametz. Therefore, that's not going to be something, if it didn't leaven, that you could actually use to make matzah on. So if it's tevel, you can't be yotzei your chiyuv of matzah by using it. Now, how do we know Rabbi Shimon? Tanya, Rabbi Shimon omer, ha'ochel nevela b'yom kippurim, very famous case. If you eat a carcass of a dead animal that wasn't slaughtered on Yom Kippur, patur, you're exempt. Okay, Rashi says we're talking about shogeg, you did it unwittingly, and we're talking about exempt from the sacrifice, the korban chatat that you're supposed to bring. Now, Rashi adds something interesting. Rashi says, let's just read Rashi inside. Patur mi chatat, de'ein isur Yom Kippurim, chalad isur nevela. In other words, the assumption is isur nevela came first. Okay, let's just assume, we're assuming right now, although Rashi is going to say in another minute, not the case. We're going to assume it died before Shabbat, before Yom Kippur, and then Yom Kippur kicked in. So what's it forbidden, Mishum? Not Yom Kippur. It's only because of Nevela. But he says, V'im bo bayom nitnavla, even if on Yom Kippur itself it became a Nevela, afilu hachi ayta asura kodim Yom Kippurim mishum ever menachai. He says, wait, Nevela is just an extension of Ever Menachai, that you can't eat from a live animal, right? Both are kind of, you can't eat from a live animal, right, while it's alive, and you can't eat from it once it dies if you didn't slaughter it. So he views, and this is a very interesting approach, he views Ever Menachai, eating taking a part off of a live animal and eating it, is just, Nevela is just like a continuation of that. So therefore, even if it died on Yom Kippur, it still was forbidden because of this from before Yom Kippur, okay? Because of Ever Menachai. Tosfot does not like this at all. And Tosfot says, what are you talking about? Ever Menachai and Nevela are two different things. Kasheleri in the third line of Tosfot. Dehaki paka isur Ever Menachai yachula leisur Yom Kippurim Nevela bevat achat. Let's assume in his scenario, the animal dies right as Yom Kippur starting. So as soon as it dies, what happens? There's no longer Ever Min HaChai, that disappears. So while that disappears, in comes two new things all at the same time. Now, when you hold Ein Isur Chalal Isur, it's only if they both happened at different times, meaning one was there first, like the Tevel, and then it leavened. But here, they both come at the same time. Even Rabbi Shimon will say it's forbidden both because of Nevela and because of Yom Kippur. So he doesn't really agree with Rashi that if it was Navla Bo Bayom. Well, he does in the end, but he brings a different explanation. He doesn't think that it's one continuum with Ever Min HaChai. This is a little bit off the daf, but it's just very interesting in terms of our concept of Nevela and Ever Min HaChai. Are they one and the same? Tosfot says, no way, those are two different things. And then Tosfot suggests, Yesh Lomar, about 2 lines down, Afilu ninavla b'yom kippurim lo chayla leisur yom kippurim. Why? The isur she'ein zavua chavabe. It wasn't called Ever Min HaChai before, but what was it? What are we allowed to eat of an animal? Slaughtered meat. Well, yesterday this wasn't slaughtered. It was still alive. It wasn't slaughtered. Today it wasn't slaughtered. So it's also, right? It's dead now, but it's also not slaughtered. So he says the whole continuum is really just a nevela issue, that it's all one continuum. Okay, so I see someone's asking, it's a good question. I think I read it very quickly, but I assume they're making the connection. Ever Min HaChai is forbidden to B'nai Noach. It's one of the Sheva Mitzvot B'nai Noach. So if that's the case, would nevela be connected with that, right? I don't think anybody says that, but maybe it's a good question. So like what the ramifications are of this comparison. Anyway, it's an interesting comparison. We're going to move on. So the first answer is to say that he must hold like Rabbi Shimon, who says Ein Isur Chalal Isur. Now, there's all sorts of exceptions to the Ein Isur Chalal Isur rule, okay? If it's an Isur Kolel, if it, like one of the questions on the sugya would be, Ochel Nevela b'Yom Kippurim, generally you would say, well, Nevela was forbidden yesterday, but today Yom Kippur forbids not only the Nevela to be eaten, it forbids anything to be eaten, and that would be an Isur. Right, there's Isur Kolel, there's Isur Mosef. I'm not going to get into the differences between them, but there's all sorts of ways where even if you say Isur Chal Isur, then Isur Al Isur, there would be, or the rabbis who disagree. Anyway, I'm not going to get into all the discussion about the different opinions. But now, Ravina gives a different answer. Ravina doesn't want to say that he only holds like Rabbi Shimon. He wants to say Afilu Tema Rabanan. You could explain it also according to the rabbis who say Isur Chal Isur. So now, Misha Isuro Mishum Bal Tochal Chametz Bilvad. But you still could say, even according to the rabbis who think that this is Asur, both because of Chametz and because of Tevel, still they wouldn't allow you to make matzah with this. Why is that? Because it has to be something that's only Bal Tochal Chametz and doesn't have anything additional on it. That type of thing could be used for matzah if it didn't leaven, let's say. Okay, right? In other words, again, potentially, it could be forbidden only if it leavens because of leavening, but not for any other reason. And that's why Tevel wouldn't be able to use. But the Gemara says, right? Right. So here, just read one more line. Yatzazeh. So this would be an excluded. This is still his explanation. It's not only going to be forbidden because of Bal Tochal Chametz if it were to leaven. But it would also be forbidden because you're not allowed to eat Tevel, untithed produce. So the Gemara questions, Midi bilvad ktiv, but it doesn't say lo tochal lav chametz only. It never says the word only. Where'd you come up with that? So therefore, elam mechuvarta kedirav sheshet. They reject Ravina. They say this doesn't really make a lot of sense. We're going to go back to the first explanation that it must be according to Rabbi Shimon. Now we're going to start the sugya, which is basically the main sugya that we're going to talk about today. And you'll see in the chart, I charted out, even though we're only going to get to the second part later in the daf. But there's two basic questions, which is, and then we'll get sidetracked a little bit, but there's two basic questions, which is, so we talked about Tevel. Now the question is, can you eat Maser Sheni? Can you eat matzah made from Maser Sheni if you're eating it in Jerusalem? Remember the Maser Sheni, that's the one that you're supposed to bring a tenth of your produce to Jerusalem and eat it in Jerusalem. Usually you redeemed it on a coin and then bought something with it in Jerusalem. Let's say you spent your money in Jerusalem and bought wheat. Could you make matzah out of it and eat your matzah in Jerusalem and be yotzei your chiyuv matzah? So we're going to have a machloket Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yossi Aglili. The second question, another machloket Rabbi Yossi Aglili and Rabbi Akiva, which is why I put it on the same chart, so also you can see the differences, is bikurim. Can you also eat matzah made from bikurim, which is the first fruits that you bring to the temple, you give to the Kohen. So can the Kohen, let's say, eat the first fruits from the bikurim. Use the bikurim to make matzah. Remember, bikurim could have been brought from the 7 species. So we have chita and seorah, wheat and barley. So theoretically, those are 2 of them. You could make matzah from those. So can you be yotze? So we'll get back to that one. First, we're going to start with Maser Sheni. We're quoting a Braita, Tanu Rabbanan. You might have thought you fulfill your obligation through Maser Sheni b'Yerushalayim. Let's say you eat it in Jerusalem. Maybe you could. Talmud Lomar, lechem oni. Now we're going to darshan this word lechem oni. Generally, and this is always a problem when you read a translation, what does lechem oni mean? Generally, it means a poor man's bread. Okay, but not necessarily. We're going to see 3 interpretations of lechem oni today. Only one of them will be connected to a poor person. So the first drasha is Rabbi Yossi Aglili, who doesn't think it means poor man's bread. And he takes the ayin in oni and switches it to an aleph. And he says, Masha ne'echal be'aninut. Oni is when you're in onen. Onen is the status of a person after one of his close relatives or her close relatives die. And they're waiting for the burial, right? And usually they're dealing with the burial, so they're exempt from all sorts of commandments. And one of the things they can't do, and this comes up in that ceremony that we say for Bitul Ma'asro, when we get rid of all our maaser from the house, is to say, I didn't eat ba'oni mimenu. And they learn from there, you can't eat it when you're in owning. Okay, so they say lechem oni would be only things that could also be eaten when you're in the status of owning. Yatzazeh, so this would be excluded. Maser Sheni, she'eno ne'echal ba'aninut ela b'simcha. Okay, oni generally means when you're in a bad state of mind, the opposite of happiness. So lechem oni must mean something that you at least, not that you have to eat it when you're sad, but you could eat it even when you're sad, as opposed to it's going to exclude things like Maser Sheni that can only be eaten when you're happy. Divrei Rabbi Yossi Aglili. So he thinks, no, you can't. Rabbi Kiva disagrees. And he holds you can. Rabbi Kiva Omer, matzot riba. We've seen this drasha a few times. We're going to see it even more today. Matzot, it says matzot a number of times, and it says it in the plural. That comes to include, we said last time, we don't really know which reference to in the Torah they're referring to, but we're going to now say that matzot riba. Yes, you're exempt. I'm just looking at a question. When you're an aninut, you're exempt from all mitzvot. But this is not only you're exempt from all mitzvot, but you can't, to eat the Maser Sheni, in other words, is, I don't know if it's exactly considered a mitzvah. You're eating food. To take the Maser Sheni is the mitzvah, to separate it and then bring it to Jerusalem. You're also supposed to eat it, but I don't know if that's actually considered a mitzvah. But the point is that you can't eat that. Okay, it's just eating it. You can't eat it when you're in onin. It's a different reason. It's not because you're exempt from mitzvot. It's because you have to be happy when you're eating the Maser Sheni, and you can't be happy when you're in that state of mind. So now, Rabbi Akiva says it's from the matzot. From there, we can include even Maser Sheni. So what does he do with that if he doesn't understand oni like oni, right? Like with the aleph. What is lechem oni? Poor man's bread, as opposed to what we call matzah ashira, rich man's bread. What's rich man's bread? Not just flour and water, but you can add honey, oil, all those, right? And wine. You could mix it with that. If you do it with that, you can't be yotze matzah with, right? This is like egg matzahs, right? We call them egg matzahs. That's eggs, right? It's any kind of addition to the dough. So my time, right? Nobody, even though we're going to get to the machloket about egg matzahs, whether you can eat them or not on Pesach, but nobody thinks that you can eat them the night of Pesach. That comes from here. So he says lechem oni means poor man's bread, not with any of that stuff. It doesn't have anything to do with Maser Sheni. The Rabbi Akiva. Sorry, I skipped. My time de Rabbi Akiva, michtiv lechem oni. And he tried to darshan lechem oni and switch the ayin with the aleph. But what does Rabbi Akiva say? It's not written in the Torah the way oni should be written. Ayin vav nun yud. Okay, with a vav. But it's aniktiv. It's written as without the vav, which looks more like, if you look at it, it looks like ani, poor, even though you don't pronounce it as poor. But from there he derives it means poor. Rabbi Yossi Aglili, mikrein and ani, oni krinan. So what does Rabbi Yossi Aglili say? He says it's true, it's written as ani, but it's pronounced as oni. So you can't learn anything from ani about it. It's pronounced as oni. That's what's important. So what does Rabbi Akiva do with the fact that it's pronounced as oni, which doesn't fit in with his theory? Rabbi Akiva, Hai Dekrina Be'oni Kedishmuel. He understands, and that's what we're going to see in the end. I told you there's 3 explanations. 2 of them belong to Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva is going to say, we learn from the way it's written, ani, that it's poor man's bread, and not matzah shira, this dough made with something extra other than water and flour. But we learn from oni, the fact that it's written, pronounced with a vav. We learn what Shmuel learned. Rabbi Akiva says, and Rabbi Akiva came before Shmuel, but they're saying Rabbi Akiva must hold like what Shmuel says later. Damar Shmuel, lechem oni, lechem she'onim alav dvarim harbe. It's a bread that we recite on it many things. What does that mean? Well, that means if you remember at the table, like when we'd say matzah zo she'anu omrim al shuma, right? What do we use the matzah for? We pick up the matzah, right? Different parts in the Seder, we uncover the matzah, we pick them up. We basically use them as a prop, a teaching prop. Okay, that's what it means, lechem oni. So it's written ani to teach you poor man's bread, and it's read as oni to teach you onim. We answer, we recite. Okay, Savar Rabbi Akiva. Now we're going to go back to this matzah shira. Rabbi Akiva basically said you can't use matzah from a dough that was kneaded with something extra other than water. So, right, water and flour. So now they say, Rabbi Akiva holds, okay, so we're getting off on a tangent. He brought this in because that's what he did with the lechem oni that was Rabbi Yossi Aglili's proof. So he says, no, I learned from it something else, and now we're going off on a tangent about that. So now he says, really? You can't be Yotze on Pesach? The Hatanya, it says in a Braita, and now we're going to see a bunch of different opinions, and Rabbi Akiva is going to appear here, seemingly being the most lenient about this matzah shira. The Hatanya, doesn't it say in a Braita, you cannot knead a dough on Pesach with wine, oil, and honey. V'imlash, what if you did? The idea is, what they're worried about now is not so much that it's not lechem oni, they're worried about that it's going to rise quicker. So if you did it, Rabban Gamliel Omer, tisaref miyad, burn it immediately, because you can't make bread out of, you can't make matzah out of this, it's going to leaven. The Chachamim Omrim yachel. The rabbis saying, no, look, you shouldn't do it. But if you did it already and you made sure it didn't rise, so it's fine, it didn't rise. If it rises, it leavens, well, obviously you have a problem. But he thinks that it's possible to be careful and make sure it doesn't rise. But like he wouldn't recommend doing it. He says you shouldn't, but if you did, okay, this is what we call b'diavad, right? Already it was done. V'amar Rabbi Akiva. But here comes Rabbi Akiva's opinion. What does he say? Shabbati aytayitza Rabbi Eliezer Rabbi Yoshua. I spent Shabbat, I spent the weekend with them. V'lashti lahem isabi yain v'shem udvash v'lo amru li davar. I needed a dough for them, obviously not on Shabbat, before Shabbat. I needed a dough with wine and shemen and dvash. They didn't say anything to me, meaning it seems like it's okay. Now, what do you see here? Rabbi Akiva himself seems to say you can do it. So why did he say before, lechem oni, you can't have it mixed with anything, right? Okay, now, before we get to the answer, we're going to continue in this Braita. Okay, now we're back to the beginning, and the Gemara even tells us that. Atan the Tanakama, this line goes like Tanakama, which is, even though you can't knead it, you can, after you make the dough, you can brush on it like you would do on a focaccia. You might brush olive oil on it, or on Rosh Hashanah, you might brush honey on it. That you're allowed to do once the dough is ready. You can't knead the dough with it, but you can brush some on top. That's not going to make it rise any quicker. So that's Tanakama. Chachamim omrim et shelashim bo mekatvim bo v'et she'en lashim bo ein mekatvim bo. No. If you can knead it, then if it's something you can knead it with, then yes, you can spread it on top. But if it's not, then you can't. Meaning, since we don't allow the oil or the wine or the honey in any way, we don't allow you to brush it on top. Vishavim, but everyone agrees, she'ein lashina ta'isa b'poshrin. This is the last line, which we're going to also get back to in a few minutes, which is everyone agrees you can't make matzah dough with warm water, because we all know when we make bread, warm water definitely helps the leavening process, and therefore you can't make matzah with warm water. So back to our issue. It seemed like Rabbi Akiva said, oh, I needed this dough. So how could he have done that if he said before, you can't be Yotzei Matzah with this? So there's an obvious difference between what's allowed on Pesach and what you use for matzah on the first night. Lo kashya, habi yom tov rishon, habi yom tov sheni. So there's a difference between the matzah that you're Yotzei, that you fulfill your obligation with on the first night of Pesach, That has to be lechem oni, poor man's bread. You can't use egg matzahs or anything else. But b'yom tov sheni, and he doesn't literally mean b'yom tov sheni. This just means, and this comes up in Sukkah also, they use this reference, yom tov sheni. It means the rest of the days, other than the first night. Also by Sukkot, there's something unique about the first night, even though it's not the same as Leil HaSeder, but the rules about sitting in a sukkah are more stringent the first night. But the rest of the days, if you want to eat matzah, you can eat matzah shira according to Rabbi Akiva. Okay? Now, like Rabbi Yeshua said to his sons, Yom HaKama talushu li b'chalva, the first day, right, for the first day of Pesach, you can knead me dough with milk. Mikam va'elach lushu li b'chalva. I'm sorry, the first day you can't knead me the dough with milk, and all the later days you're allowed to. So first the Gemara stops and says, wait a minute, didn't we learn you can't make bread that's chalavi? Remember just a few days ago, we learned that about a week ago. So he says, the Gemara says, didn't we say you can't eat any dough with milk? And if you do, it's forbidden because people won't know it's chalavi. So how can he possibly say you could do it with milk? So he brought in this milk to say, oh, look, milk is like the shem and the dvash and the yayin, right? It's just something other than milk, water, and therefore you see he allowed it. And that was Rabbi Akiva's whole proof, right? That Rabbi Yeshua said to his sons, right? And that's the answer to our distinction. The first day, you have to use lechem oni for the Seder night. After that, you can use, it's not a problem, okay? We're not worried about it leavening. Whereas remember, the other opinions of the Braita were worried it leavens quickly and therefore you can't use it. So now they say, but wait a minute, how could you use this example with the milk? The milk makes no sense. You can't use milk for a different reason. Forget about matzah shira. Milk is a problem because people won't know. You can't tell that it's got milk in the dough. So elahachi kamar. So they say, okay, so we're going to have two different explanations. One is going to change what he said entirely and say that's not what he said. What he said is, Yom HaKama lo talushu li b'duvsha, mikam ve'elach lushu li b'duvsha. Rabbi Yeshua said to his sons, actually had to do with honey. It had nothing to do with milk. Okay, it was a mistake that you thought it was milk. It was really honey. V'ibait, that's the easiest answer, okay, although it's a bit of a cop-out because it does actually say milk. So how do you resolve that? So now they say, v'ibait ema, alternatively, you could say, la'olam b'chalva, it really is with milk. And then they say, k'da'ama ravina ke'ein Torah sharei, hachanami ke'ein Torah. Ravina said that you can do it as long as it's like the eye of the ox. Okay, what on earth does this mean? What does bread have to do with the eye of an ox? So they say that there's two different explanations, and both of these we paskan lahalacha. This was in Daf Mishalahen last week when they talked about shapes of dough and how you can end up with chalavi dough. According to the Gemara, you can, and in many places they're very careful not to ever make dairy bread. But you have this issue that if either you make it like the eye of an ox, which is not so big, and you make it a size that you know that as soon as you bake it, it will be eaten, then it's fine because the whole issue is leaving it laying around. No one will remember that this bread is chalavi. Or you make it in a different shape, and the shape is an indicator that this is different from the typical loaves that I usually make, and therefore you can make it in a unique shape that everyone will know that shape is chalavi, and that's how everyone will know the difference between the breads, which one is chalavi and which one isn't. Okay, so in any case, since we got to this big topic of egg matzahs, I thought that it was silly not to talk about, be crazy not to talk about the halacha about egg matzahs and the big machloket Sephardim Ashkenazim, okay, because it comes from our sugya. So what we saw here was that Rabbi Akiva says you can use egg matzahs during Pesach, right? If we call them egg matzahs, that's not what they're called in the Gemara, but I'll call them egg matzahs because that's what we have, versus, right, the rabbis who basically said you can't, and only b'di'evet, if you did, you could eat it, but really it's an issue. The question is, what's really the issue with egg matzahs, okay? Is it? Okay, Rashi seems to say that it actually could leaven, and therefore it's a problem. I'm calling them egg matzahs or matzah shira. Any of this is really all in the same category. It means a dough of matzah that's made with something other than water and flour. So Rashi seems to think that if you knead a dough with fruit juice or something like that, then it will not become really fully chametz, but it will become what we call chametz nuksha, which is a topic we'll get into in another place, which is only forbidden by a lo taseh, not by kari. Rabbeinu Tam thinks that if you knead a dough with only mei perot, it actually will never fully leaven. Okay, it won't leaven. And therefore, His issue is, he says, it could be though that if there's a little water, then it might cause it to start rising like chametz nukshin. So the Rambam and the Shulchan Aruch Paskin, basically they can never leaven, and therefore they permit it. And that's why Sfardim permit it. But the Rama says, and this is, I see what Gita, what you're saying, which is that he says you can't, right? The Rama basically says we don't eat matzah ashira, and there's different reasons as to why he says that. So some people say he's concerned that maybe there'll be a little water mixed in and it will cause it to rise, like Rabbeinu Tam says, okay? And that maybe that's the concern. Another reason given is that maybe we have to worry about Rashi's opinion, that maybe it does rise, okay? It does leaven, that's a possibility, a second possibility. The Avnei Yezer basically says these answers are not really, they're weak answers, because you can make sure that it doesn't get in. You can make sure it doesn't rise. I mean, also regular matzah could potentially rise. So what's the difference? As long as you're careful about it, then you should be careful about it, right? So he gives a different reason, which is he says, the Torah says, Shivat Yamim Tochalav Matzot, right? And it calls them Lechem Oni. So even though we said Lechem Onis for the first night, he says that maybe the reason why the Rama was strict was he wanted us to have Lechem Oni all the nights. And one of the major nafkaminas about whether you can eat this or not comes up this year, because this year Erev Pesach falls out on Shabbat, and there's always a question about what you do about Sudah Shlishit on Shabbat. You eat your first meal at night, you eat your second meal early in the morning before 10 hours into the day, even though normally we don't eat our first meal of bread at that hour, and then you get rid of all the bread, right? You leave over 2 meals of bread. What about the third meal? So if you hold you can eat matzah shira, people use matzah shira because it's not viewed as matzah. So it's not a problem of eating matzah the day Erev Pesach. At least some people view it that way, that it's not really like matzah and you can. And other people say, no, it's really a problem. You can't eat matzah shira because it's right. People view it as chametz, or it could be chametz, and it's a problem. And therefore the Rama, right, who says, but don't eat it. And then what do? So then you eat something else, right? You can't eat bread, obviously, and you can't eat the matzah shira. So you're left with, your yotzei sudash l'shit with something else like fruits or, shahakol stuff. So anyway, that's a big issue, particularly this year. And, it's an issue for people who can't tolerate matzah. Some people need to eat matzah shira. Anyway, there's a big machloket there. Tov, moving on. Shavin she'en l'shina ta'isa b'poshchin. So then we said everyone agreed that you can't use warm water. So they say, okay, why can't you use warm water? Because it might turn into chametz. And this is to make your matzah. So now they say, wait a minute. There's another thing that can't become chametz. What's that? The meal offerings in the temple. The minachot. So ma'ishnami minachot. Why is this any different from the mincha? Ditnan. Kol minachot nilashot b'poshchin. Now, we all know that to make a dough, it comes out better if you use warm water. So in the mikdash, when they would make the minachot, the doughs, they would specifically use warm water to make it better. And they're just careful to make sure it doesn't be turned into chametz. So now they say, so how could that possibly be? So they say, in other words, this goes back to something we said earlier in the Masechet. We're going to distinguish between people who are careful, like the Kohanim, who deal with the mincha offering in the temple, versus the average person who's not so careful, right? You see all the time in this Masechet, they were worried about people messing up. So regular people, right, which is funny because who makes the matzah, right? Generally, in those days, everyone made their own matzah. Now people are so super careful when they make their matzahs, right, that they're crazy about it. But they were worried that the average person might not be careful and therefore you can't use warm water. But in the mikdash, people are careful. So then they say, wait a minute. If that's the case, then you should even be allowed to boil. What they would do is they would boil the husks to take off the chaff. So they say you should be able to do that also, or, all the extra stuff, the bran. So you should be able to boil that also and not worry. Alama Amar, and it's if in the mikdash they're careful, when it comes to the minachot, why don't they allow you to do this miltat namilati? Alama Amar Rabbi Zera, Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah, Amar Shmuel, chitin shel minachot ein lo titin ota. He says you can't do it with the grains here, even in the mincha. So why, if you're careful about that, why wouldn't you be careful about that? So they say, who did, right? The latita process happened to the grains of the wheat. The kneading process happened in a much later process when they already had the flour and they were using it. So lisha bizrizin ita, latita leta bizrizin. The latita was done by the average person, not by the Kohen. So that would be a problem. Whereas the lisha was done by the Kohanim in the temple, although we're going to see not necessarily. But right now, that's what they're assuming. So now they say, lisha mi'ita bizrizin? Really, the Kohanim do it? V'haktiv, it says in the verse about the menachot, v'yatzak ala Hashem, and you put the shemen on it, v'heviya ala Kohen, and then you bring it to the Kohen. So what do they learn from this pasuk? Mikmitza v'elach mitzvat kuna limed al yitzika u'blila shera b'chol adam. There's a few processes that happen, right? You mix the dough, then you add oil. I'm not going to get into it, but you make these, you kind of would fry it, then you would break it, it would get hard, and you break it into teeny pieces, and then you would do the oil on it, depending on which one. Different ones are made differently. The point is that when it says in the pasuk, all that stuff happens, and then it says you bring it to the Kohen, which means they derive from there. Even a regular person, not a Kohen, can do the earlier stage. So if that's the case, why aren't we worried that they're not going to be careful? So they say, this is very interesting theory, and it makes a lot of sense. Where was this done? Even if it was done inside the temple in the Azara, which means even if it was done by a Zar, it was still done, right? A non-Kohen, it was still done in the temple. You can't do it outside the Azara. So they basically say, even if we think the average person might not be so careful, but when they're in the temple, right? Think about it. If you were in the temple, you're going to have a lot of more kavana there, more intent, more, right? You're going to be much more careful. So there we can assume you're going to be careful, whereas the average person doing this on Pesach with their matzah wouldn't be. So now they say, wait a minute. And therefore it's to exclude latita de anibus reason below b'makom's reason. But the latita, that early process to the kernels, that was done outside the temple and by anybody, and therefore there we have to worry. Last question on this topic. Umay shnami minchata omer. But the minchata omer, detani minchata omer. Okay, this is the one they brought. Remember, even on Pesach. But besides, it's not a Pesach issue. It's really a general mincha issue. Lo titinota v'tzovlinota, you were able to boil the kernels for the minchata omer. So how could you do that if it's done outside the temple and not by a kohen specifically? So the answer, tzibor shane. Okay, what does that mean? This is very interesting. There's different explanations. I'm just going to put it out there, but I'll explain by the main one, which is the community is different. Okay, again, this is the same type of idea. This is all psychological, right? When you go and you're doing something for the community, right? You're going to be a lot more careful about it than if you're doing it just for yourself. People are much more careful with other people's stuff. Therefore, when you do it for the korban mincha, you could do the latita. Again, the latita is going to make it just a better. There's this play here. On the one hand, you want it to be the best possible wheat, right? The best possible flour, the cleanest. So you'd rather clean it as best as possible and boiling the kernels before it gets off all the extra stuff better. On the other hand, you're worried about it becoming chametz. So here we say, right, we'll strike a balance. When we think people will be extra careful about it, we can do that. When we're not sure they're going to be extra careful about it, then no. So if you're doing it for the community, which the minchata omer is the communal offering, as opposed to most of the minachot went with your own individual korban, or it was your own, you said, I'm going to bring a mincha to the temple, a meal offering. So those were personal, okay? Different personal and community. Tanu Rabbanan. Remember I told you we're starting out first. Can you do it Maser Sheni? We got off on a lot of tangents about the dough and then all sorts of concerns about it rising, leavening. Now we get back to our topic about Bikurim. So remember, when it came to Maser Sheni, Rabbi Yossi Aglili said no. Rabbi Akiva said yes. Okay, and Rabbi Yossi Aglili said no because of Lechem Oni. So now again a machloket about Bikurim, but the machloket here is different. They're going to each say the same thing, but bring different verses to prove it. Talmud Lomar. So we're starting with Rabbi Yossi Aglili again. Where are you supposed to eat matzah? Everywhere you live. So what does that come to exclude? Matzah, only matzah that you can eat everywhere. Bikurim, you have to eat in Jerusalem. So therefore, it's not going to work. So, יצאו ביקורים שאין הנאכלים בחומש שבטיכם, אלא בירושלים, דברי רבי יוסי הגלילי. Rabbi Akiva Omer is going to learn it from somewhere else, but also is going to say no. Matzah umaror. Ma maror, okay, what does it say? Matzah goes together with maror. Well, we're going to learn then, it's what we call a hekesh. They're in the same verse. We must learn one from the other. Ma maror she'eno bikurim, af matzah she'ena bikurim. You can't bring maror from bikurim. Why not? Because there's none of the 7 minim, the shivata minim, none of them are anything that can be used for maror. So therefore, also matzah can't be made from bikurim. And since maror can't possibly be one of the bikurim that you brought to the temple, also this can't be the matzah. So then they say, wait a minute. If you're going to learn it from maror, learn it all the way. Ima maror she'ein b'mino b'bikurim, af matzah she'ein b'mina b'bikurim. Otzi chitinu seorim sheyesh b'minam bikurim. Wait a minute. If you're going to say we're going to learn it from maror, well, since maror, none of the shivata minim can be maror, maybe we should say, no, forget about, they can't be bikurim. They can't even potentially be bikurim. Any of the things that could be bikurim can't be maror. So why don't we say any of the things that can be bikurim can't be matzah? Like what? Chitim and so'olim. Maybe you can't make matzah, this would be crazy, from wheat or barley. Okay, so Talmud Lomar, why don't we say that? Matzot, matzot, riba. That's because it says matzot, matzot. Again, this inclusive, which seems to include even one of the things that could potentially be bikurim. So then they say, well, matzot, matzot, riba, filu bikurim nami. Then we should say, let's take it all the way and say, even if they're bikurim. So Rabbi Akiva basically rejects his own pasuk. And then they say, Hadar Rabbi Akiva. Hadar Rabbi Akiva, he obviously changed his mind. Even though we thought we could learn it from matzah and maror, in the end, we're going to see, we're going to bring this braita, we're going to have to show, even though it doesn't say it's Rabbi Akiva, we're going to have to show it must be Rabbi Akiva's opinion. And then we're going to say, in the end, he learned it from the same verse as Rabbi Yossi Aglili, B'chol Moshvotechem. Okay, so he started to learn from matzah and maror, the comparison. In the end, the comparison doesn't hold because we end up saying basically no wheat and no barley. So therefore, the comparison drops. So here's a braita to prove that Rabbi Akiva changed his mind. You might have thought you can do that. Talmud Lomar, what do we learn from here? So we have to exclude from b'chomosh v'techem. This is the verse that Rabbi Yossi Aglili used. Again, we're going to have to prove that this is Rabbi Akiva. You'll see in a minute how. Now, you would have thought, if it's b'chol moshavot, what does it say by Maaser Sheni? Also, you have to eat it only in Yerushalayim. So therefore, you shouldn't be able to eat matzah from Maaser Sheni. Talmud Lomar, matzot, matzot, riba. So they say, oh no, the word matzot comes to include Maaser Sheni. Now, if you go back to the chart at the beginning of the page, or you look back at the Amud Aleph, what did we say? Who said that Maaser Sheni is, yes, you can be Yotzei Maaser Sheni in Jerusalem? That was Rabbi Akiva. That's why this must be Rabbi Akiva who's authoring this braita, because he's basically saying, Maaser Sheni, yes, Bikurim, no. Remember, Rabbi Yossi Aglili said both of them no. So therefore, we're going to assume this is Rabbi Akiva, and that's how we're going to prove B'chomosh v'techem comes to prove Bikurim. The braita continues. We have, again, this is a classic. We've had this many times recently, especially, where we have one pasuk, which comes to exclude, B'chomosh v'techem, only things that you can eat anywhere, not Bikurim, not Maaser Sheni. Then we have matzot, which comes to include. So that's going to include something. So let's take something from the excluded category and now include it. What will that be? Maaser Sheni. So the obvious question is, Uma ra'ita, l'rabot Maaser Sheni u'lotzi bikurim. It seems a little arbitrary. Why don't you take bikurim and say bikurim yes, and Maaser Sheni no? So what do they answer? Marbeh ani Maaser Sheni she'en lo heter b'chol moshavot. I'm sorry, sheyesh lo heter b'chol moshavot. Maaser Sheni, potentially, there is a case where you could eat Maaser Sheni outside of Jerusalem. What is that? Kidder Rabbi Elazar. Should be Rabbi Elazar, according to the Masoret Hashas. They correct it. Umotziani bikurim she'en le'mater b'chol moshavot. In other words, what's the difference? Bikurim can never be eaten outside Jerusalem. Maaser Sheni, in a particular case, can be eaten outside Jerusalem, as Rabbi Elazar says. What's the case? Now you have to remember, when it talks about Maaser Sheni, what does it say? If you live far from the Beit HaMikdash, you're supposed to bring them to the temple, right, to Jerusalem. If you live far from Jerusalem, what do? You redeem it onto a coin. They learn from there, only if you're far from Jerusalem can you redeem it on a coin. But once you're in Jerusalem, and let's say you either brought your fruits with you or you bought fruits in Jerusalem with your Maaser Sheni money, you can't redeem those fruits, okay, because you're in Jerusalem. Only outside Jerusalem are you allowed to. But now we're going to learn, Amar Rabbi Elazar, if it becomes impure, then you're allowed to redeem it. How do we know this? Now, lo tuchal se'eto is the verse where it says, if you can't carry it, it's too heavy to carry to Jerusalem, so redeem it on a coin. But they darshan se'eto from last week's parsha, Ve'ein se'et ela achila. Parshat Miketz, right? It says, Shenemar v'yisam mas'ot me'et panav. He gave his brothers portions, okay? Portions of food. Remember, he gives his brother these portions of food. So what do you see? Se'et is eating. Lo tuchal se'et means if you can't eat it, meaning if it became impure, you can't eat it. So then even when you're in Jerusalem, you're allowed to redeem it, which means theoretically, once you redeem it, you could take those fruits outside Jerusalem. So you see that there is a way to eat the Maser Sheni outside Yerushalayim, and therefore we say Maser Sheni is the one that we're going to include and say you can use for matzah and not bikurim. So again, this I already told you, but man shamat le de amar Maser Sheni nafik be. Who's the one who thinks you could use Maser Sheni for matzah? That's Rabbi Akiva. And what do you see? So we learn from here he must have changed his mind, and in the end he agrees with Rabbi Yossi Aglili both about the halacha, which originally we also thought he agreed in terms of bikurim, and also about the verse that he proves it from. Now they say, Rabbi Yossi Aglili, wait a minute, why didn't he learn it from the same Maser Sheni pasuk? Remember, from Maser Sheni he learned lo tochal be'oni, right? When you're owning. So tepuglemi lechem oni, misha ne'echal be'oni. You're supposed to eat when you're happy. Also, you don't eat them when you're an onin. So why didn't he learn it from there? So they say, sever like Rabbi Shimon. He must have held like Rabbi Shimon. Tanya, there's a machloket about whether you can eat bikurim if you're an onin or not. Bikurim, and when in a minute we're going to see what their basis for the machloket is. Bikurim asurim laonin. Tanakama says an onin can't eat bikurim. So Rabbi Yossi Glili, who didn't darshan this, must have held like Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon matil. He thinks when you're in onin, you're allowed to eat bikurim. What did the rabbis learn? Okay, you have to read the whole verse. You can't eat in your gates, meaning not in your own city. You have to go to Jerusalem to eat. Okay, it mentions the maser there. And then at the end it says Trumat Yadecha. And Amar Mar, there was a braita about the words Trumat Yadecha, Elu Bikurim. The Truma refers to Bikurim, the first fruits that you bring to the temple that are given to the Kohen. And what do you see in this verse? They're listed in a list together with Maaser. We do what we call a hekesh again. To eat kish bikurim la'Maaser. So since Maaser is asur la'onen, af bikurim asur la'onen. So we learn from here that you can't eat them when you're in onen. Rabbi Shimon, what does he say? Who thinks you can? Well, he says, look at the wording. What do they call bikurim? Truma. Truma klinu rachmana. Therefore, kit truma, they're just like truma. Ma truma muteret la'onen, af bikurim mutar la'onen. Just like truma, the Kohen can eat even if he's an onen. Also, bikurim he can eat even if he's an onen. For Rabbi Shimon, nami nihida kesha lately simcha miya michtav k'tiva b'hu. It's true, maybe you have a hekesh here, but it says v'samachta b'kol hatov. You're supposed to go to the temple, be happy with all you have. You have to be in a happy state with the bikurim. So what do they say? Hahul is man simchu da'ata. That doesn't mean your state you are when you. It means you're supposed to bring it in a time of simcha. And here's something very interesting, especially related to we're now right after Hanukkah, and you can associate with that, you can connect with this, I think. Titnan, when are you allowed to bring bikurim? You're supposed to bring them on Shavuot. What if you didn't? You can bring them all the way until Sukkot, and you can bring them exactly the way you were supposed to bring them on Shavuot. You can bring them and say what we call the text of Mikra Bikurim, which actually we read it on part of it at Seder night, Arami Oved Avi. Supposed to read this whole section. Me'achag va'ad Chanukah, from Sukkot till Hanukkah, mevi ve'eno koreh. You can bring it, but you can't say the text. After Hanukkah, you can't bring it at all. What's the difference between these time periods? Because the harvest, right? That's the time period. The big happy time period in agriculture is from Shavuot to Sukkot. After that, it's not so great, right? It's not a great season, and you're running out of your stuff that you have, but you still have produce from last season, right? But nothing's growing right now. Next, after Hanukkah, there's nothing, okay? It's like dead season. So this reminded me of those sources that talk about Hanukkah. Like there's this source that talks about Adam HaRishon, that right, he saw the days were getting shorter, and he thought that the world was going to be destroyed. And then all of a sudden the days start getting longer right at Hanukkah time. And the Hanukkah is this holiday of lights because it's starting to get lighter. It's almost like this depressing time of year. And he says, right, this also appears here, that it's not a time of simcha at all. It's a time when people are worried about their new crops for next year. And it's a stressful time period. So anyway, they learned that pasuk, v'samachta b'chol hatov, has to do with that and not with this. Okay, let's just quickly do the end. Tanu Ravanan, lechem oni, prat lechalut ula'ashisha. Lechem oni, again, we're going to darshan another way. It comes to exclude. Chalut is boiled. Either you boil the flour or maybe it's like bagels, right? American bagels where you boil the dough and then, right? So it's a boiled process. You can't make matzah that way. Or a shisha, which is some huge loaf. It reminds me of like at a wedding, you have these huge loaves. You can't make a gigantic matzah. Maybe you have to use real poor man's bread, which was in those days whole wheat. That was the worst because you didn't clean out the flour. So maybe that. Again, it doesn't have to be the absolute worst, right? You can use, and then they're going to say, afilu kematzot shel shlomo, which were the finest flour possible. You can make your matzahs out of that. You just can't make it huge, and you can't make it boiled. So what's lechem oni then? If matzot matzot riba, again, prat lechalut ula shisha. So now they want to know, how do you know a shisha is a huge loaf, like it's something important? That it's an important, significant kind of bread, and against lechem oni. This is in Sefer Shmuel. They gave out the bread. Okay, they gave out to each one a lechem, an ashpar, and an ashisha. So what is Amar Rav Chanan bar Abba? Ashpar echad mishisha b'pal. They got 1/6 of an ox, of a bull. Sorry, va'ashisha echad mishisha be'efa. That's 1/6 of an efa. They're darshaning the word ashisha like shishit, or ashpar, one of shishit. Okay, 1/6 of an efa. An efa was a huge amount of dough. This is a big, big amount of dough. Upliga de Shmuel, they disagree with Shmuel. Damar Shmuel, Ashisha, and that verse is Garba de Chamra. It was a thing of wine. It had to do with wine. It didn't have to do with bread at all. Okay, we'll stop here. We'll talk next about other things that you can or can't use. Okay, I see. Thanks for sharing that. 6.5 to 8 pounds of flour. That's obviously a huge amount. Okay, have a great day. Shavua tov, everyone.